First of all, I just want to point out that designing tables can be quite challenging. It's not always clear what a user is supposed to do with the information inside of the tables in the first place, and that makes designing them even more difficult. Well-designed tables are going to allow a user to scan, analyze, compare, filter, sort, sometimes manipulate data, most of the time gain knowledge or insights, and most importantly, act confidently. So if you're designing a scenario that has something to do with one of those situations, then you might need some sort of table. So before we go too complicated in table theory, let's just dive into some simple examples and get progressively more complex. Let's take a look. So first of all, we've got Intercom's pricing page pulled up here as it looks today at the time of this recording. And this is definitely a table. I don't know if they're actually using a full proper table or not. They're not actually using table code, but that doesn't really matter because you can format any type of information to be in like a table format. It doesn't necessarily have to be a table tag online. It's just a matter of displaying information in a certain way. So right here we have a huge headline: start, grow, accelerate, scale. They're making decisions based on the names of these packages, and they're doing a really good job of showing hierarchy of, okay, package name. The next thing that I'm seeing and noticing on most of these is going to be the price per month. And then you can tell they're obviously trying to push this plan the most. They have extra visual contrast up here with the teal color. They've got this little chosen by 53% of businesses tag. And then also if we zoom way out, maybe not that far, you can tell that they've made this one intentionally darker because they want that to be the focus. But this is a great example of when I need to scan and analyze and gain insight and then possibly take action. So it's like, okay, how many seats? Okay, 1 seat. Okay, let's see, 5 seats, 10 seats. One thing that they could have done a little bit better is possibly line up the seats with each other. You can see all of these seats are lined up, but this seat is kind of popped up here, so you can't fully scan all the way across. It's still nicely laid out, and it's probably not that important because this one is a little different. This one's kind of the starter plan, and then this one's everything in Start Plus, everything in Grow Plus, everything in Accelerate Plus. You can see more. It's just a nice way to compare and analyze all of this different information. Now you could imagine if this same information was in just some boring table without much style, it's going to lose its emphasis. But the big headers and the big numbers and the calls to action really make the table come alive and give it a little bit more information that a user can use to make a decision confidently. You can see on this Streamline Icons website, I created this table to show the difference between the two different packages, the Essential package, which has 14 categories, and the Ultimate package with 53 categories. So again, this might not be a true table tag that is an actual HTML table, but the same principle applies nonetheless. And we strategically ordered these to be the same here and the same here. That way it was very easy to show, okay, technology, business products, all of these are not included, whereas all of these are included. And if you scroll down a little bit more to see the full packages, you almost have another bit of a table. This is possibly borderline not quite a table, but again, it kind of is. There's a headline, a little bit of subtext, and then these individual rows and a call to action. Same thing, headline, subtext, rows, and other calls to action. But it's very specific in the way that it's trying to show information. It's not just a big table full of data, just raw data, like here's everything and there's no affordances, all of the data just kind of splattered at you at once. It's carefully thought out in terms of smallest, medium, largest, and then showing how many icons you get in each package and what you can expect if you get the entire package, and so on and so forth. Here's another really simple example for the Flowkit pricing section, where you have, again, a title for the table. You could almost imagine these as 2 columns in a table, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rows of information. So, but again, we don't necessarily have to have a bunch of borders and dividers. Everything doesn't have to be the same size. We can really take liberty with the way that we modify the information inside of the table to make it make the most sense for the user. So in this case, I'm downplaying the name of the package, and I want to highlight the price because a lot of people are going to be making a decision on price. So I put that front and center. And then we have basically the same amount of information: full library, Sketch, Figma, XD files, Figma plugin license, 1 year of updates, unlimited projects, and then you have your license. You can scan back and forth pretty easily. Okay, 1 license and 5 licenses. And then we're also adding another link there so we can go off and see, like, okay, how does the license work? We don't necessarily have to put how the license works inside of this table. We could have potentially put a small snippet about how the license works, but it would have also crowded this particular table layout. And in this one, we want to be able to scan and analyze, and we can use all of our typography and layout and color and style decisions to really enhance the data inside of this table so we can have it perform and do the job that it needs to do. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and let's look at some raw data inside of a design file and look at how we can use this information, and we can style different tables based on whether or not it needs to be read-only or editable or any other number of things. Whatever the design challenge at hand, we can change the data and change the way it's displayed depending on the purpose for what we're trying to serve, the action that we're trying to let someone take. So let's just dive in. Okay, so I've got just a very, very simple little table here. You'll probably recognize everything that's going on here. We've got the Shift Nudge course, module number, name, lesson, total time, author, and then possible action. So this might be data in a table, and you can see I didn't really spend a lot of time trying to organize this very much. I just have this giant group, a few different groups within groups, and then everything is there. And so when you're laying out a table, it doesn't really matter necessarily if you have a bounding box around the table, or maybe you just put all the information out and you draw lines and dividers. It just kind of depends on the way that makes the most sense for you to be able to manipulate that data. So if we look at one version over, you can see in this version, I've started to make a little bit more decisions around styling the information. So instead of having every single text field the same exact size and color, in this one, every cell is 152 pixels wide by 38 pixels tall. So everything's exactly the same, whether or not there's a really long word or a short number. Everything is the exact same. We've now decreased the width of this smaller row because there's just a single digit number. And then we've also decreased the width of these additional sections here, lesson and time. And we've kind of made everything a little bit, each cell is kind of shaped a little bit differently. So we've also added a smaller type size here. So these are 16 and these are 12, all caps. You can tell I've knocked the color back, and I've also knocked these lines back a lot more. So these are now 333 instead of, this just solid white. This is just raw information coming at us. And now we're trying to make a few more decisions on how to handle and how to treat this information in the data. In this example, we are designing a nicer looking table, but we're not really designing for a specific use case. We're just trying to make this one look better. And I think we've done a decent job, but it's not really solving a particular problem. So let's keep looking. All right, so in this next one over here, one thing I've done here, now you can see, what if every cell doesn't need a border? What if every row and column doesn't need a vertical divider? And what about some of this repeating information? Course, shift nudge, shift nudge, shift nudge. If you find yourself repeating information over and over and over, it might not need to be in the actual table itself at all. Same thing here with the author, and maybe even with this edit button. So in this example, I've pulled shift nudge out of the table, and I've pulled away the author. That could be technically self-explanatory, or maybe that's somewhere else. Maybe if you're looking at this table, you already know who's teaching the course. And maybe, just maybe we don't need the ability to edit this. Maybe this is being designed for a student and not necessarily the administrator for manipulating this data in the first place. And you can also tell I've removed the number from this information and I've paired it with the actual module. So 1-start, 2-typography. And then instead of having all these vertical dividers, we can just put in some light gray dividers and give ourselves we're also bringing in these images now and making sure we have very consistent spacing between elements, lots and lots of big negative space to help this information breathe. But then if this is the route that we're going to take with this information, and if we know that our use case for this particular table of information, maybe it's just for a student to access that information. So maybe the table gets simplified even further. And so we take the lesson count and the time involved in each module, and then even the name of the course. Maybe the name doesn't even have to be there. Maybe people know where they are. And we can just turn this table information into something in terms of just a simple list that is a lot more actionable. And I can actually just scan, okay, start, typography, layout. And I've really started to bring in the more important information up front, and some of that lesser information that's still important. And maybe some people care about it, but it's not as important as maybe the name of the module. So we're bringing it in 10 lessons. In this particular example, I would like to figure out a way to not say lessons every single time, but I don't know if there's a way around it in this example. So that is a trade-off that I would be willing to make in a layout like this versus doing a full table like that, because I don't think that we really need a separate individual list like this inside of this table if, and that's a big if our main priority is to just get someone to click this to get into that particular module. Here's another variation where it's kind of the same thing, but we've included the author name up here, the title name up here. So we're trying to figure out eloquent ways to manipulate the content. So this is as much of a content design exercise and even a content creation and editing exercise as much as it is a table design exercise. Because if you just take everything at face value and someone says, hey, we need you to design something that looks good for this table, and you just say, okay, and then you just go and you adjust the borders, you adjust the dividers, you make some nice typography decisions, and you increase the padding, and you make things look relatively nice, you're doing a disservice at the deeper root level in terms of, okay, why should that be there? What purpose is this table serving? And you don't always get to make those decisions, and you don't always get to be a part of those conversations necessarily. But the more you can ask why should we do this? Why should we do that? Without being too stubborn about it, if that makes sense. I mean, it really depends on the context of your project and your team. But if you have a very strong understanding of why we need a table for a certain task that we want a user to accomplish, it'll make your job a lot easier. Sometimes you might just need a table design because we might need to use tables at some point and we want to know how they look. That's fine too. In that case, you can just figure out some nice looking borders, some nice looking padding. And in that case, you might realize, hey, we don't need any vertical dividers. Maybe we don't need that. And you're going to be really focused on, okay, this should be left aligned. You might come in here and say, man, I wonder what this looks like if we left align all that. That could possibly work. A lot of times you're going to right align numbers and not left align them, but then that might actually end up looking weird with the title. And the same thing here, you might want to right align your time, but sometimes that could look weird if you're not dealing with currency or things like that. Sometimes center aligning smaller amounts of information can be a little bit more useful. And another thing that I really think is important to point out here, this particular font that I've been using for Shift Nudge, it has what's called tabular figures associated with the numbers. And really what that means is tabular numbers is just a monospace version of the numbers as opposed to the standard varying width numbers that come standard with most type sizes. So let me just copy and paste these off to the side just so you can kind of see the difference here. So this is tabular numbers. And then this one, I'm going to go into Figma and I'm going to scroll down here to numbers, and we're just going to do the standard style here. So you can see, look at the difference between this 11 and the 12 and the 10. I think those are some of the most glaring areas for this particular example, where the 10 and the 11 and the 12, they're just not quite that scannable. And so when you're using these tabular numbers, notice that one got a little shifted. This is going to create basically the same size box for every single character. So we have, this is not quite exact, but you can kind of see what I'm getting at here. But just make that 1 pixel smaller on each side. You can see that each one of these characters is going to fit into this very rectangular tabular version, and using tabular numbers And again, you'll have to find a font and make sure that that font supports tabular numbers. This font does, and you can activate it in that kind of ligature panel, or the whatever this is called over here, the type detail panel. So you can activate that, and that's going to create much more scannable numbers. It will create a nice monospace version of those numbers, and it works really well inside of a table. And I've done the exact same thing here with the hours and the seconds. Also, this works really well if you have a countdown timer. If you want something to count down, if you don't use tabular numbers, the width is going to change. When it goes down to a 1 and then it goes to a 5, the width will change over and over, and it'll just, if something's counting down, you really don't really want the hours and the seconds and all the labels kind of jittering in and out. So tabular numbers is going to be the way to go for things like that. So what if this list wasn't designed for a user to click and see more information about that module? What if it was a back-end administrative panel and I could manipulate this content? Well, then we might actually need an edit button, and then we might need to start thinking about typing into an input field and having the ability to save and cancel. So there's different ways you could do that. Maybe each one of these is an input field. Maybe this is the only thing that you can change in this particular table. So instead of showing just read-only data by default, we just go ahead and pop an input field in there instead. And then if you were to click on an input field, maybe this is what it looks like. And so we're just kind of editing right in context. So we're just like, okay, start. We could change that right here to maybe this is, maybe we want to call it begin. We hit save, and then all of a sudden this little pop out goes away, and then that's in place. And then if that's the case, we might not need this edit button over here. But you might have data in your table that might not need the individual editing abilities. You might need to edit the entire thing at once. And if that's the case, you might have something that looks more like this. Maybe this is your field and you click edit on one of these, and then the entire thing changes. And so now I have maybe a drop down of multiple course names that I've created somewhere else. Maybe I can change this. I can change the amount of lessons that are in here. I can change the author. Maybe the time is based on the number of lessons that you reconfigure. There are definitely some UX considerations that are not thought of in this particular example, but I just want to show the diversity and the range of possibilities that you can put into a table that might have edit capabilities versus read-only capabilities. And maybe this is our little cancel button to make all of this go away without saving anything. Typically, if you ever want someone to enter into edit mode, you want to also provide a way out that would allow them to cancel everything and don't save any of the changes. And a lot of times that can be a cancel button. A lot of times that can be an X icon. It just kind of depends on the style and the way that your project is leaning. All right, so maybe we have another example where we don't have single line editing capabilities the way that we had up here. Maybe we want to edit everything at once and save everything at once versus editing, saving, editing, saving, editing, saving over and over. So in this example, maybe we just edit the top layer, shift nudge. That should actually probably be aligned to the baseline, would probably look the best there. And maybe this aligned a little bit with that content might look a little bit better. Maybe something like right in there. You could also center align that possibly, but you also have to remember that we're going to have, this would be more of a table heading, and we wouldn't always be able to decide exactly what goes here and exactly what goes down there. So a lot of times it's best to design something like this, a heading, kind of like on its own. And so maybe it does look better if this is like all the way over there or slightly indented, regardless of the information below it, because you won't always be able to control the amount of information that is going to be showing in here if you're kind of designing for a system type approach. So let's say we're editing everything all at once and we're not going to edit things one single line item at a time. So maybe we hit the edit button here, and then all of a sudden we're in full edit mode, and we can either cancel to go right back to where we started, or we could get in here and start manipulating the information. Maybe when you hover each individual row, maybe we get this background with a little handlebar here that we could actually grab and rearrange. So maybe we don't actually change these numbers at all, but rather as we rearrange this, the numbers update automatically. And we can also change the name of the module. We can change the dropdown of how many lessons. And then we could change the author, so on and so forth. So this is another example of how the same exact information could be displayed depending on the use case. So we have all these different versions that serve different purposes. Same information, but it's all serving a different purpose depending on what you need to do with that data. And then I also want to point out that typically, most always, you're going to need to end up figuring out how to display table information on a mobile display. So right here, this would be an example of trying to really fine tune that information and get it spaced in a way that this is maybe information that's not going to change much in terms of like extra rows, extra columns, etc. And it's all going to fit perfectly on this fixed width layout. And this is exactly how it needs to be, and nothing really needs to change. But a lot of times you might have this flexible, growing amount of information, especially in terms of columns. Lists and vertical height, growing and vertical height is usually always a lot easier to deal with because you can just scroll and scroll and scroll. If something's expanding on the horizontal axis, it can be a little bit trickier to handle. So in that case, a lot of times you can just put the same exact form, even if you're grabbing one of these and sticking it on that mobile screen. If you do that, you can add this little small shadow. And a lot of times a small shadow like this, a little utility gradient, is going to be enough to indicate that you can kind of swipe left and right on that information. And it doesn't have to be a huge, big shadow. You can just do a small little shadow that kind of indicates that there is more there. And then if someone starts swiping this to left or right, then I have another version that has that same utility gradient on the left. So this one has the left side and the right side. And you could imagine kind of what that would look like if you were swiping it left or right. And actually this entire thing would probably be going, so it's not quite as accurate, but you get the idea. So now we have this kind of swiping back and forth. But these are all going to be conversations that you need to have with the people on your team. You need to have these conversations with your developer, whoever's in charge of making the decisions. What is the purpose of the table display data that we're doing? Is it, does it need to be manipulated by everyone? And if so, by who? And just asking lots of questions. The best way to design for a table and the information inside of a table is to really know what it's going to be used for. And sometimes, not always, it can be a little easier to actually design a table with code. So if you look at this example, I've got a lot of table HTML here. We've got our headings and our rows and all of our cells. I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to cover the ins and outs of this because I feel like you can get in here and you could even start editing this and changing it, just playing around with your own and figure out a lot of this if you've never touched HTML and CSS before. So if we wanted, for example, to make shift nudge and elements, if we wanted to change every single one of these at once, I could just go in here and say, okay, instead of hot pink, I want my current, this is the class name that I gave to that particular row. So I want my current color to be white instead of hot pink. And now you can see that all of this text is now changed. And it didn't take me, I didn't have to go and click every single individual element inside of Figma or Sketch or XD or anything else. It was just one line of code that applies to that entire section. And so sometimes it can be worth fiddling with the CSS because you can manipulate this stuff a lot faster. It can kind of hinder your creativity and it can be a little bit slower, but if you get it to a certain point, sometimes if you get it to close to being designed, putting it in code and saying, okay, well, let's look at these background hover effects. Do we want to go with this like dark gray? And instead of having the entire row, maybe we just do an individual cell being hovered. So now we're showing like what each one of these cells hovered looks like. And maybe that's not what we want. So we change it back. You could even change the color of this to go, black instead of gray. So there's lots of different ways that you can play around with these tables and experiment with hover effects. And, I think it's most important to remember that you're not actually making a final table. You're designing a picture of what the table might look like. So if you can get it into code, or you can get with the developer to put it in code, and maybe you can sit beside each other or have a chat about, interaction patterns or even creating a prototype inside of Figma or XD or anything that supports those animated states. A lot of times that will give you a little bit more information in terms of making decisions for how that living, breathing final table might kind of come to fruition. And then you'll get a better idea of everything. Oh, I didn't think about the hover styles. Or, oh, maybe we should remove the borders on the top and the bottom when it's being hovered. And that might just be a couple lines of code that you need to go in and change. But a lot of times you might not think of that information or think of those little interaction patterns unless you have it inside of a prototype like this. I want to finish on a really practical example from Steve Schoger, who created the Refactoring UI book. In this example, you can see we have kind of a nicely designed card with a house and a label, lots of labeled information. And if you were to show me this and you would say, hey, what do you think about this? Does the type look good? The space look good? Everything actually looks pretty good. This has a nice feel to it, nice spacing, nice use of typography. But what are we trying to really put forward with this information? If someone's actually trying to buy a house, most of the time, they're primarily going to be concerned with price. So if you look at the one on the right, it's nice because now I don't have to guess. It just hits me in the face, $750,000. Here's the address. Maybe you go 5 years old, or maybe you keep it 2012. That's kind of debatable in terms of what you would want to do. But showing 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, you could do without the icons, or you could leave them in. And then you have, an image of the real estate agent. And this just seems like a nicer way to show that prominent information. So someone might ask you, hey, can you design our tables? And it might actually not be a table that you need at all. You might need an actual card design that shows this in a more intuitive way. Okay, for table homework, I want you to look back at some of those pricing examples that I showed in the first part of the video and come up with a 3-tiered approach to the pricing for the fictitious app that you've been working on for some of the previous lessons, and show the 3 tiers with progressively more features for each plan, and call out the major differences, larger or smaller type. Maybe the call to action is slightly different, but you decide how you can kind of take liberty with certain information inside of a table to accentuate. Maybe it's the middle one you want to call out, or maybe the other one. And so play around with accentuating different parts of those pricing plans. You can name them, you can add illustrations if you want to, or you can keep it simple with just text only. And then once you have that, another exercise will be design a table that's somehow related to the internal workings of your app, whether it is a back-end dashboard that needs editing, or it might be a list of things that is for a user to kind of click through. And you can use that Figma file that I walked through as some examples for editing one thing at a time, or editing multiple things at a time and saving it all. So you decide what needs to go in there, ranging from simple to complex. Create a few different tables and see what you can come up with. So best of luck on your table homework.